Hello, hello. Welcome back to Coach Free Corner. My name's Dej. I am here with Dr. Taylor Day. Hello, Dr. Taylor Day.
Hello, how are you? Thanks
I'm
for
doing so well. It's so good to see you. And you go by Dr. Tay, correct?
yes, but you literally can call me whatever. I even tell the families I work with that. I'm like, call me whatever. I don't care.
Right, whatever comes out. So, I'm going to jump right into your bio. Today, we're talking about not only early autism diagnosis and just that diagnostic process, but also PDA. So, I'm really excited to jump into that. But first, let's get to the bio. So, Dr. Taylor Day is a licensed psychologist specializing in neuroaffirming care for autistic children and their families, including very early diagnosis and early intervention. She has a PhD in clinical psychology and is the CEO and founder of Dr. Tay Concierge Clinical Care. Her practice integrates the whole family approach, a process she created utilizing evidence informed principles after seeing a gap in autism care. Her passion for child psychology and her focus on autism is in many ways tied to her own personal experience growing up with a brother who was diagnosed at 23 months of age. Wow, I love how you have that personal connection. A lot of us in the therapy world or who work with small children, we usually have that personal connection.
Totally,
We
totally.
have our why, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So I kind of want to jump into, before we get into clinical psychology, can you kind of tell us about your experience growing up with your brother?
Yeah. So, thanks for reading the bio. It's always so weird to hear your bio
Yeah.
read. But yeah, like it said, my brother was diagnosed at 23 months of age, but it's important to keep in mind this was over 2 decades ago. He's
Yeah.
24 now. But we are 10 years apart. So I was 12 when he was diagnosed. So it was
Wow.
very aware and in tune of what was going on. Ultimately, he went through very intensive intervention. We had therapists
Hmm.
in our house for about 45 hours a week. Um,
Wow.
and so it definitely was a lot. And so, one of the things, too, I think not only getting into this field absolutely shaped, or was shaped by this early experience, but I also think the way in which I provide care was very much shaped by that too. Because one of the things that I found, and I think in many ways it's not that different nowadays, is
Hmm.
that care and like therapeutic support approaches usually focus on the autistic child, which is so
Hmm.
important. And we know that, from a lot of research outside of the autism field on family systems, nothing is like can be isolated. There's always an impact, right, on the family system and how the family system then impacts the autistic child and all of that. And I just saw that my parents were not supported through this journey. And in turn, then they didn't know how to support me through this
Yeah.
journey either. And, I always say they did the best they could, and it wasn't always enough.
Hmm. And so that kind of leads to now how you created the whole family approach. And so tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. So, ultimately, I feel like, again, a lot of care focuses on the autistic child. And I'm still doing that and
Hmm.
still very much, helping parents to strategize and plan for things. I do a lot of care coordination, for example, of like
Mm.
helping them to navigate different systems, find neuroaffirming providers, all of that. But one of the biggest things that I do very intentionally is I love being able to stop and pause and actually ask the parent what they're experiencing,
Hmm.
how they're navigating all of this. Or we will talk about siblings too. Like, how do you support your non-autistic children through this journey? Or if you have multiple autistic children, sometimes that doesn't always jive too, right? They might have
Yeah.
different approaches. And I think, it one like tangible example is, I think a lot of times we're like, okay, you need to do all for your autistic child, if it's the right approach, all this prep work, helping them to transition. You hear something like visual schedules, for
Yeah.
example. I think visual schedules can be amazing, but I also have seen parents where it completely shuts them down in trying to create them. And so I once had a session with a parent. We were talking about it, and we knew it was going to be right for her child. And she's like, yeah, yeah, I got it. And then came back the next week and I was like, how did it go? And it was like, well, I didn't do it. I was like,
Yeah.
and you could see there was so much shame there. And I was like, that's okay. What got in the way? Let's problem solve right here. And for her, her brain literally was like, but wait, do I need to get something to laminate it? How am I going to print it? What am I putting on it?
Mhm.
Like all of these like executive functioning tasks. And this mom has ADHD and she's like, my brain just shut down. It was like, okay, here's what we're going to do, you know? And like we problem solved it right then and there. But I think acknowledging, it's one thing to like strategize, but to also
Mhm.
acknowledge the shame that's coming up and create space for that.
I absolutely love that. And I feel like that as a therapist, right? I'm a speech language pathologist and I work with a lot of OTs and PTs. And that's, I would say, the primary audience of this podcast. But I love that perspective from the clinical psych because I feel like you're kind of able to look at it like from that whole family approach, like you said. Whereas sometimes we can be a little bit rigid in our thinking of like, okay, I'm working with the child, I have goals for the child. That's why I really love early intervention and how everyone's being inspired to go bagless and to use what's in the home because that even carry that's just increasing carryover and kind of like building that confidence for the parent that I don't need a bunch of toys from Target, like I can use my pots and my pans and things like that. So I absolutely love the whole family approach and how you are giving us language for something that we want to do, we just don't always know how to do because they don't teach us that in grad school, right?
They don't teach it, but then if I'm being really candid, I also think that, a lot of times there's not the time and space. If we look
Mhm.
at in terms of providers and their caseload and what has to happen, like it's very goal driven and insurance drives a lot of that as well,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that creates additional layers where I think about the systems not
Mhm.
supporting therapists and knowing how to do that. So I don't blame any therapists in this,
Right.
but it's like you're not getting the educational training. It's being
Mhm.
driven by either like your metrics from the company or, the setting you work in. And then insurance is saying, what are you doing? And so I think there's a lot of pressure and a lot of ways that as a whole, these systems are failing, autistic children and their families, but it's no one person's like problem. So I also don't want anyone to hear this and be like, yeah, I should be doing that. Like, I hope you can take little tidbits and be able to incorporate that. But I also think we need massive system changes.
I feel so validated when you just said that, because I feel like everything you said basically. I don't even have to re-say it. You said it beautifully. I want to backtrack a little
Yeah.
bit to how you got into clinical psychology. Like give us kind of that journey cuz you said you watched your brother kind of have loads and loads of therapy. I'm sure maybe speech, maybe some behavior things, not sure, but what kind of made you go clinical psych rather than like a therapist?
Yeah. So I'll just share. So my brother was in 40 hours of ABA a week. He had speech OT. I think he was working on feeding for a while. I don't
Mhm.
remember everything, but
Yeah.
definitely the whole gamut. Which is interesting now being a neuro affirming provider. I look back and I reflect on certain things that were done where I'm like, okay, maybe
Hmm.
not the most optimal. But that could be a whole other topic. But
Right.
ultimately, I will be honest that my brother had a lot of growth through intervention and through these therapeutic supports. He went from when he was diagnosed at 23 months of age, he had no spoken communication, really no consistent communication, was having 2+ hour meltdowns, was opening and closing doors repeatedly. We weren't
Mhm.
able to leave the house because, like, all the sensory, like, my mom talks a lot about, like, the mall was so overwhelming and stimulating for him. And 2 years later, we saw a lot of reduction in, some of these like meltdowns, all of that. And he was like fully, using spoken language at that point. So we did see a lot of progress. And
Yeah.
from that age, I was so curious about like, what about this where my brother, ultimately had this progress, but then we see other kids that don't, right? And
Yeah.
so my brain was very scientific in that regard. I
Mhm.
knew I like wanted to get into the research and figure it out and all of that. And ironically, I even, so in high school, like this is how dedicated I was. And I had this clear vision. My high school had the International Baccalaureate program, which is
Yeah.
similar to like AP classes, but you can do like a whole diploma. And I had to write an extended essay, and I was like, I want to do it on autism and early intervention. My mentor was like, no, that's too ambitious. And I was like, nope, I'm doing it, and I ended up doing it, and ended up like being one of the top 50 extended essays in the world that year, which is
What?
my school had never had. And like that was my commitment. I had that clarity because I just was so fascinated by all of this. So I went into college knowing that's what I was going to do. I was actually planning to go to med school all
Mhm.
through undergrad. And then towards the end of undergrad, I started to discover research and
Mhm.
started to be like, wait a minute, like I really want to be a researcher. That was my goal in all of this. And, there were a few different things, but ultimately decided not to apply to med school, was like, let's get research experience. So I worked for 3 years after undergrad. And what I realized is that a PhD in clinical psychology was this perfect intersection of getting the research training. Medical doctors actually don't get that much research training. And
Mhm.
then also, I could jump into the field right away. If I found mentors who specialized in autism, it wasn't having to go through like it would have been with med school, where I was waiting many years until I was able to work with autistic children. So it felt like the perfect intersection, and just like so spot on. And I will say, all of my graduate training, even leaving with in graduating with my PhD, you have to do a year of clinical training. I always was like, I'm not going to be a clinician. I'm going into research. And so I got basically a research focused position. It's called a postdoc. And did that for 2 years. It was on a NIH grant, and I just wasn't finding the joy, and I missed those connections. And so I took like a basically 180-degree turn and was like, okay, we're going to do this. I'm going to be a clinician full time. But my thing was, is I didn't love the existing system. So I was like, I'm going to launch
Mm.
my own practice and do it the way that really felt aligned for me. So it's been a bit of a journey, but I needed all of those pieces, I think, to get where I'm at now.
For sure. And I feel like ever since you were in IB, you've been breaking down barriers and walls that people tried to put up in front of you. I love that. That just tells me a little bit about your personality. That's so spicy. I love it.
It is spicy. Yeah. I'm like, you tell me I can't do something, I'm going to find a way.
I love that. We need more of you in the world. I love it. I love it. So, okay, as far as your clinical training, was a lot of that through mentorship? Because I know when you're, studying in a with like research in mind, you don't get a ton of that hands-on. So, was a lot of this through mentorship?
Yeah, so in a clinical psychology PhD, I mean, there's different types of training programs. Mine was very research driven, but you still had to have that clinical training.
Gotcha.
And you do that full year of clinical internship before you get your PhD. That's our equivalent of like residency.
Gotcha.
So it definitely was there. It was built in, but I chose a mentor that specialized in early diagnosis of autism. So,
Mhm.
she had research studies that we were diagnosing kids and like screening kids and following kids in the context of these research studies. And so I really got training in the very, very earliest diagnosis. We were seeing kids starting at 12 months of age. The youngest I've diagnosed, I believe, is 15 months, but like I've seen 12-month-olds where I'm like, yeah, this is autism. But then we couldn't do the ADOS because they had to be walking. And so we'd have to
Right.
wait a little bit. But that kid ended up getting diagnosed at 14 months. I had another clinician do it just to make sure, right? But I think people are really surprised how young autism can be diagnosed. but there's been like huge studies showing that autism diagnosis is stable as young as 14 months of age. So it was a really unique opportunity to be able to get that training. And yeah, just kind of I slowly became like the person who was doing all the autism consults. I mean, I had a very broad training. I saw adults, for example, with depression and
Mhm.
anxiety as part of my clinical training. In my clinical internship, this was, I didn't realize it at the time, was pretty monumental. I did it at Duke, and I got training in couple and family therapy. Again, I didn't think I was going to be a clinician. I will say I pull in so much of that into my
That
work.
whole family. Mhm.
And so, yeah, so it kind of was like building this path. Autism was always at the center. Even my clinical internship, I applied to an autism track. But what's really interesting, just to comment on this really quick, because I was coming from such a research based program, everything was evidence based treatments, right? And
Mm.
that was like
Mhm.
the focus, evidence based practices. And it's really hard because in the autism field, there already aren't a ton, right?
Mhm.
And so it was having to kind of like use principles, all of that. But I got zero training on neurodiversity, all these neuro affirming approaches, like PDA. I never heard about it before, a couple years ago, all of that. And so, while I love the training that I got, I feel like it's made me savvy in terms of how to consume different therapeutic supports,
Mhm.
and I still pull a lot in. There's also things that I've let go because I'm
Yeah.
realizing they aren't the most affirming.
Yeah, I feel the same way about my training. A lot of people feel this way that, if you're in this kind of world working with autistic kids, it's like, there's no textbook autistic kid, right? And so we're living and we're learning. You brought up PDA.
Yeah.
Let's talk PDA.
Let's
So
talk. Okay.
for any any individuals who don't know what that is, it is formerly known as pathological demand avoidance. But Dr. Tay, you can kind of speak to this a little bit. I've also heard persistent desire for autonomy. So kind of talk to us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So I want to kick us off in talking about this. I think this is an important piece to know. This is a theorized profile. So what that
Okay.
means, there are some studies on it, but we're still very, very much learning. And it's right now, it's best conceptualized under the autism umbrella. And so it's almost a theorized profile of autism. The thing is, I think in any of this neuro affirming space, we're kind of like feeling it out and figuring it out. But what I have found is it has been very, very validating for a lot of the families I'm working with. I've also found that it helps a lot of families start to begin to realize that their child is autistic when maybe they previously haven't. And so I think we can validate, and a lot of autistic adults with this PDA profile talk about the lived experience. So I think we
Hmm.
can validate that and also then be mindful in terms of what we know about it and that it's ever evolving. But yeah, it was coined many years ago as pathological demand avoidance. And then, autistic adults and talking about it really, I've heard a bunch of different kind of versions of it, but like persistent or pervasive, like drive for autonomy, or you said desire, like I've heard that. But
Yeah.
what it is, in short, is the nervous system goes into a fight or flight response in to demands and a perceived loss of autonomy. So
Mm.
really that loss of autonomy is the central piece there, but demands and like instructions and telling individuals what to do often creates that loss of autonomy. And so it's basically that the nervous system is overactive and that it literally goes into this panic or fear based response in
Mm.
response to everyday situations. And so it can create a lot of dysregulation for, I'll say, for the child, because I know we're talking generally about children right now. And it ultimately, it can look very defiant, very oppositional, but I like to really contextualize it under this anxiety framework, that it's this fight,
Mm.
flight, freeze fawn response, and is an indicator. It's communicating to us that this child does not feel safe and that they are perceiving something as a threat.
Thank you so much for that breakdown. I feel like we are so used to seeing our little carousel posts definitions on Instagram about everything out there, but like to really hear it kind of broken down from what you see. Thank you for that. That really has like kind of, brought it into perspective for me. So with that, how are you kind of helping families? Is it more of a giving them supports and counseling around this area? Is it more, I know you said it's more theorized, so not necessarily diagnosing, but being able to identify this in the profile. Kind of tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. So, in terms of autism diagnostic evaluations, ultimately, if a family's coming to me and saying, "Hey, I've read about PDA," and this happens literally all the time, I would say it's probably my number one referral right now. I've learned about this. Well, then we're assessing for autism, right? And
Mm-hmm.
diagnosing autism. But I actually will put PDA in the report and talking about some of
Okay.
this because I think it can be helpful for the parents to learn more about it, as well as other, providers or teachers or educational staff that are reading the report to better understand it. For me, I choose then to usually, I always say usually, I always have so far diagnosed a co occurring anxiety diagnosis so that, it can really be conceptualized from this anxiety framework. So I think that can be helpful. Not all providers will do that. There's some,
Mm-hmm.
that don't know about PDA yet, or they're hesitant to do it. And my kind of thing is I would rather kind of be on the forward thinking side of this and really helping to support these children and families and really seeing the child for what their needs are, and learn maybe once we know more about it that I'm wrong, than to ignore it and come at it from a very behavioral approach where it's like, well, your kid is hitting, so we need to figure out how to get rid of the hitting. So this is a great example, and this is neurodiversity affirming in general, but it's like, okay, why is that kid hitting? What is, and yes, a behavioral approach would say why, like what's the antecedent or what's the trigger, but this is like more, what's it trying to communicate? What did we miss in the communication? How can we support? How can we help regulate? And so I think it just lends itself to a different approach.
Mm-hmm.
And to answer your first question, yeah, it's a lot of coaching with parents to help
Mm-hmm.
them have this mindset shift that their kid isn't intentionally doing this. They're not choosing to do this, but rather their body isn't allowing them to do this. And Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Ross Green says, it's a quote of like, kids will do well when they can. And really having that mindset of like, if they're not able to do this, it's because they can't versus they won't. And so I think that's a huge piece of helping parents to navigate this, and figuring out different strategies that can help to support.
Absolutely. And I love that quote, first of all. And secondly, I feel like this also helps therapists. And, my podcast is all about collaboration. Do you find yourself having to or being in spaces where you are collaborating with maybe the speech therapist and PTOT, those kinds of things?
All the time. So, one of my like primary ways after families get a diagnosis that I support families right now is through my group therapy program.
Mm,
And in that, it's all parents of autistic children. I will say a lot of them also, have children with this PDA profile. So we're talking about it quite a lot. But it's like a mix of what's great about it. It's a mix of a support group, where they get to hear other parents' experiences, but then they're getting this clinical support, they're getting this
mm,
coaching. But as part of this, I also build in care coordination. And so I find myself a lot of times, working with other therapists that are providing direct care
mm,
to the child to figure out how can they also integrate some of these approaches as well. And when I say approaches, just to name it so it doesn't sound like I'm being like elusive in it, it's things like declarative language, like
mm,
describing, instead of saying like, I need you to pick up your clothes, it's like, I'm noticing there's a lot of clothes on the ground and I keep stepping on them. That's more of an indirect form. Or something more direct in terms of declarative language would be like, let's pick these up together. I'll start, and that, it's more, it's not telling the kid exactly what to do. It's allowing them to have a sense of choice and autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
reducing demands where possible and where reasonable. So I come at this from an approach of anything related to safety should never be a demand dropped. But also, there's a lot of demands that we don't realize as adults we're doing. And so, little things of like, hey, sit down in the chair, like in terms of therapy, or like, oh, I need you to hand me that, or things like that, little things. And there's ways to drop those and really focus on that relationship and connection. And then I also love the idea of what's called strewing, which is a form
Mm.
of choices where it's like setting out a bunch of different things and allowing the child to choose. And so it's a very child led approach as
Yeah.
well. And so, yeah, I collaborate a lot with different providers in helping them to integrate this so that ultimately it's not me trying to tell them what to do, but
Right.
rather to help them understand how they're going to be able to get the most out of their therapy sessions, because that relationship and that feeling of safety and autonomy is going to make such a dramatic difference.
I absolutely love that. I wish I had a clinical psychologist reaching out to me to coordinate care. That is amazing that you do that. And it's amazing. And this all really stems back to your ideology of the whole family approach, right? And not even just the whole family, but the whole team approach, right?
Yeah.
And how that's things that you think about, right? And sometimes there's time barriers, knowledge barriers, attitude barriers, all the things. But I just love that you're kind of shifting that atmosphere from the jump of like, hey, we're all in this together. If you need some education, I got it for you. Let's do this, right?
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to backtrack a little bit because you have so much experience, so much knowledge, and I just feel like I want to just get everything out of you. So early diagnosis of autism.
Yeah.
What are some, I mean, you're talking about as early as, what, did you say 14 months?
Yeah.
Like that blows a therapist's mind, I feel like, because we the way that we're trained, or maybe this is just environmental things, but we tiptoe around it a lot, right? Like we're like, oh, I don't want to say it. Should I even put in the report? And parents are giving feedback like, no, tell me, right? And so I feel like we're in this weird space now where we're feeling a little bit more confident about our knowledge, wanting to say it, but definitely not at 14 months. So give us some kind of tips and tricks, maybe some key considerations, things like that, because it is something that definitely is a little anxiety inducing for therapists.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it this way, and is remembering that the parent is the expert of their
Yeah.
child, right? And you're in there collaborating with them. And I tell parents this all the time, even in doing diagnostic evaluations. I'm like, your input matters. But there's a couple different approaches that I think can be really, really helpful. First, describing some of these things that you're seeing and gaining agreement on them of like, hey,
Mm,
I notice, he is repeating, scripts from, movies and TV shows. Have you noticed that? Or I'm noticing like he really loves organizing things by color, and gaining that agreement before you ever even mention the word autism as a possibility. I think that's one kind of like a foot in the door approach, but you're
mhm.
starting to plant the seeds and helping the parent to recognize these things. Because, like you said, most parents are saying they actually want their therapist to be saying this. But I realize that it's also scary, and you don't always know if they're the parent that wants to hear it. If
Yeah.
you get a big wall, a big resistance over some of these things, like, no, I'm never seeing that. Okay, yeah, that's just something I noticed. I'll keep watching. Let's keep having a conversation about this. And then
Right.
maybe that's your pause at the moment.
Hmm.
And you just keep talking about like, oh, like describing it for them. What do they notice? Having these conversations, building that rapport before you ever say, something like, I'm curious. We've been talking about a bunch of different things. Like, has autism ever come into consideration for you? So you're inviting the conversation. You're not saying, I think you should get your child assessed. And again, pay attention. What does that conversation look like? Are they
Right.
saying, yeah, I've been wondering? So my own mom mom was saying she kept waiting for the speech therapist to say it. And then finally the speech therapist brought it up and she's like, I've been waiting for you to say something. The speech therapist was like, I couldn't really say anything, you know? But I think at least inviting this into the conversation also might make it where a parent says something to you first. But again, if you notice that resistance, you don't need to push it right away.
Right.
This is where building that alliance can be so helpful. So I think that is one approach. If it's more of a direct approach, I think asking kind of more open-ended questions of being like, I'm noticing your child's language is delayed. What do you know about language delays? What have you
Mhm.
been researching? Because like we know right now, for example, like Gestalt language processing is like popping up everywhere on social media. And they might be like, oh, I really resonated with that. And again, that's your entry point. So asking them what they know first, and I think it actually can lend the conversation. I think the other piece is you do need to say the word autism. And maybe
Yeah.
it sounds silly, but maybe you need to stand in front of a mirror and practice and rehearse this, right? To get confident in saying, like, I am noticing some autistic traits,
Yeah.
or have you ever considered autism? Actually saying something along that lens and knowing that, again, if they react negatively, you can always step back a little bit. And worst case scenario, it completely ruins the therapeutic alliance. It's okay. I know it feels so bad,
Yeah.
and maybe they stop coming to you, but they're going to realize it at one point or another, and they'll look back and, it might take a while. They might never feel appreciative, but it could have been that seed that helps their child to get the support they need.
I was just thinking that you're just planting those seeds along the way,
Yeah.
ultimately for the benefit of the family.
Yeah.
Love
Absolutely.
love that. So I'm just learning so much. Like if you just see me taking a pause, it's because I'm just like processing all of this. That was amazing, all those different approaches and things. So when you are collaborating or you have a family that maybe it's not landing, maybe not the rapport is not broken, but it's kind of made things a little bit awkward. Kind of how do you get back to healing that rapport, pausing on the conversation a little bit? You know what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely. I think bringing it back to, because when you are saying, I see autistic traits, or have you considered autism? There is just this natural hierarchy that
Yeah.
happens of, therapist above parent, because you are
Hmm.
bringing in your specialty. You are bringing in some of your knowledge and expertise. And so, what I recommend is flattening that hierarchy or even allowing
Hmm.
the parent to be above you, of like
Hmm.
going back to, okay, what are you noticing? Tell me, like, I want to hear the day to day because I'm in your house. I say this all the time, like, in terms of work, like, if you're in their house, you can say, I'm only in your house for 30 minutes once a week, or I'm only in your house for an hour once a week. Like,
Hmm.
help me to understand. Or I'll say something similar of like, this is such a tiny snapshot into how much data you have. And so I think just going back to asking them a lot of what they're noticing, what they're experiencing, I think that can help to like reestablish that relationship and empowering them that they do know their child,
Yeah.
and putting that relationship at the center of everything, I think is going to be the best thing that you can do. I also think, I'm going to say this blatantly, like, you have to be okay of sitting with your discomfort too,
Hmm.
right? That you want the parent to say it's okay. You want to be able to have that repair moment. You might not get that repair moment right away,
Yeah.
right? And so that creates a lot of nervous system dysregulation for any human. And you are human, right? And it's important to remember that you're human in this.
Hmm.
And so, but at the same time, how can you create space for yourself that this feels really uncomfortable? But that doesn't mean it's a reflection of you as a therapist, right? It's like that's your human response. And yes, maybe there's some things you can learn from it, but you also have to remember that you did your best in that moment that you could at that time, right? And that there can be continual growth, but I guarantee we got into this field because we're helpers, like recognizing like, okay, that was the best I could do right then
Mhm.
there, and that's okay.
Dr. Tay, just send the invoice. I just got a counseling session. I needed that. That is so valuable. You are such a wealth of knowledge. So, okay, I have a couple more questions for you. I wish I could keep you just forever, but where do you kind of see this neurodiversity movement going? You know, the knowledge now of PDA and GLP, all of these different things that are theorized now, but hopefully, we do have a lot more research on. Where do you kind of see all this going? I know it's a loaded question.
Wow, I don't know if I've ever actually thought about this other than the extent I say it's going to be really interesting to like listen to a podcast, a year from now, 5 years from now, and be
Yeah.
like, yeah, I disagree with myself. And I think
Hmm.
that's the mindset that we need to have in order to move this forward is we're doing the best we can right now with the knowledge we have, and that's going to be growing and evolving. And for I can be very perfectionistic. It's the high achiever in me. For so long that was really hard for me because I wanted all the answers about neurodiversity. I wanted to know that I was doing it right. And I had to sit with the discomfort of like, okay, we only have so much right now. So
Right.
I think having a growth mindset is what is going to move this forward. And I think is what's going to help this continue to catch on. In terms of like where things are going, I mean, one like concrete that I think is so important is having conversations like
Hmm.
this, speaking up when we're not seeing neurodiversity affirming practices, collaborating with your colleagues, being like, hey, have you heard about this? And having these conversations. And so I do envision a lot of therapists are going to be moving in this direction. We're
Yeah.
starting to see it, but it's actually still pretty shockingly slow. I think I sometimes live in this bubble, especially like on Instagram, of all these amazing affirming therapists, and then sometimes I go to the real world and I'm like, okay, we're not
All
there
right.
yet. Yeah. Or I'll sit like in an IEP meeting and I'm like, okay, they don't
Mm,
understand this yet. And that's okay too. And we need to give them grace because we were
right.
once those people, right? That didn't
Absolutely.
understand this. But to be able to answer your question, I think we are going to see it grow. I think in turn, what's going to happen is there's going to be this inside out effect where it's going to be because of in the inside, us as therapists and providers leading the charge, we will start to see more of that impact on research.
Hmm.
And I think that's what's going to drive it forward. I think being in academia, though, I don't want to make this sound hopeless, but research is incredibly slow. It's one of the reasons that I chose to leave the field because I actually didn't. I'm not saying research is important. I don't want anyone to hear that, but I didn't feel like I was having the day to day impact that I really wanted to be able to have.
Yeah.
And it's just so slow. And there's a lot of like political aspects that are connected to it of what's funded, what's not. Like a lot of therapeutic supports and interventions and treatments aren't really being studied at this point other than to say what is what we call the mechanism of change, what is the thing that's actually causing or underlying the improvement. And
Hmm.
so we have to realize that it's going to be slow, but I do think that there can be this inside out effect where we're really driving it forward. I think we're going to see creativity in terms of who's funding some of this research to be able to get it out there. But I think we don't need the research right now. I hope we get there. But
Yeah.
again, we don't need it in order to make a really huge, impactful change. And so I think that's where we're going to go. And again, I think we're going to learn we were wrong in some regards too, as we keep listening and learning, in particular from autistic voices.
Yeah.
And we're listening. I mean, this is one thing I think about. We listen to a lot of autistic adults right now. Incredible, right? But
Hmm.
what about the children that are actually going through all of these approaches? What do they have to say about it? Because, I think for autistic adults, they didn't get to live this. And so we also need to be empowering the lived experience around some of these shifts and saying, does it actually work?
Yeah, that is, yeah. I've never thought about it like that. I'm asking you the question. I haven't even thought about that part. Wow. I'm gonna sit on that. I'm gonna chew on that for a while. Thank you so much. You are such a wealth of knowledge. I've learned so much. I'm sure my listeners have learned so much. So, where can people find you, your resources, learn more about the whole family approach, all the things?
Yeah. So I hang out a lot on Instagram. So it's the Dr. Tay with periods in between. So doctor is just DR. And love providing free education there, as well as my podcast, which is called Evolve with Dr. Tay. And so it's a podcast designed for parents of autistic kids. And then in terms of like my services, the best way to learn about that is at drtaylorday.com. So just DR Taylor Day. And I am building a team of practitioners to be able to serve more families. What is really, really cool about psychology, and I'm praying we start to see more fields go this way, psychology has a compact. So usually clinicians are restricted with their license on whatever
Hmm.
state they're licensed in. Psychology, all these states came together and said if you're in one, you join the compact, you can practice in all of them. So currently, at the time of recording, I think we're in 40 states being able to provide telehealth services. So those are kind of the primary ways that I'm working with families. I am slowly trying to work on resources for families that can't get direct services because of that licensure piece. So the best place to learn about that though will be on my Instagram and when I announce all of that in the future.
That is so amazing. I'm so looking forward to all the things happening on your end or your corner of the of social media. Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to get this out and have my listeners learn more about PDA, early autism. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having me. And this was such a great conversation. And actually, one other thing that I thought of, I do have a guide of like how to find a neuro affirming provider, some of the questions you can ask, and how to know someone is affirming in their approaches and some of those strategies. And so that could be a free resource that we could provide to the listeners.
Yes, we will for sure have that in the show notes. So if you're listening, look in the show notes for that freebie.